Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to present here. What I will talk about today is a report that the World Bank published last May on the decarbonization of development. So the report was written by the Office of the Chief Economist of the Climate Change Group, led by Marianne Fay. Sorry. And this is more or less like the first piece. The second one is being published next week on Thursday and is a broader discussion on poverty and climate change. In that presentation and in the report we published in May, we really focused on the decarbonization issue, so more than mitigation side. And the next piece will be more about the impacts of climate change on poverty and poverty reduction. So first, a few words about why we decided to do this, and it really started from frustration. Frustration about all the discussions about the 2-degree target with very little discussion about what it really means in terms of the challenge. Frustration about the planning we're talking about. So the World Bank and many other institutions are very much involved with countries to develop low-carbon strategies, low-carbon urban planning, and so on. Most of this planning is relatively short-term. We're talking about 2020, 2030, and we felt that it was really important to present the long-term challenge and to discuss how this long-term challenge can get included in the planning that we're doing. And the third frustration, and maybe the biggest one, is all of the conversation about what should be done, with maybe less conversation about how to do it, what are the very practical obstacles to the implementation of the policies we're talking about, and what can be done to make the policies we're talking about more acceptable in social and political terms, and more feasible and compatible with all of the other policy goals that countries have. Can be development, can be poverty reduction, can be ensuring affordable housing, how to bring the climate change policies and targets within all of these policy goals that governments have. So this is what I will try to discuss briefly this morning. So the starting point was this fact, which a lot of you probably know very well, but at least until last May, talking with people around me and with governments, this was not self-evident. The fact that to stabilize climate change, to stop the increase in temperature, you need CO2 emissions to get to zero. So this is the challenge. And this is very well shown by this figure, which is out of the last IPCC report. The x-axis is the total emissions starting from the 19th century, so the sum of every year's emissions. And on the y-axis, you have the temperature, global temperature. So climate models are super complicated. The climate system is super complicated. A lot of feedbacks and nonlinearities and so on. In the end, when you average everything, you get a straight line. So sometimes life is easier than without. The consequence of this, which is that basically the global temperature is linearly related to cumulative emissions, means that regardless of your objective, you have a budget. So Carlo mentioned that just a few minutes ago. You want to stabilize temperature at 2 degrees. We don't really know this budget because there are a lot of uncertainties, but we know that there is a maximum amount of emissions that we can emit. You want 3 degrees, exactly the same thing. But it's completely independent on your temperature objective is the fact that you want emissions to get to zero. So it simplifies. When you talk with government or anybody, at least this is something we know. I mean, we won't let climate change go up forever, so we know that at one point emissions should go to zero. So how do we do this now? So we followed the advice of our communication office. You need 3 steps. That's how Amazon sells books about losing weight or doing whatever. You always need 3 steps. So we have 3 steps. The first one is about the planning and how do you do this planning. The second one, what a surprise in this place, is talking about policies and carbon pricing. And the third step is what I talked about earlier, how to make that socially and politically acceptable. So let me go through these 3 points. So when we say zero emissions, my first experience with that was that the reaction was people laughing at me, which is a bit embarrassing because people thought that it's just impossible. So this is science fiction, we can't do it. If you dig a little bit into the IPCC report, the good news is more or less we know how to get to zero emissions. And most of the models agree on how to get there. And there are 4 things that you need to do. The first one is to get zero carbon electricity. This is really the first thing. The second one is fuel shifting, and especially using more and more of this carbon-free electricity that you get thanks to the first pillar. The third thing that you need to do is improve a lot energy efficiency. And the fourth one is to create natural carbon sink to compensate for the residual emissions that you cannot cancel. So we know that to get to zero emissions, we need to get these 4 things right. And we know that to get these 4 things right, by the time we want emissions to be at zero or negative, we need to start working on these 4 things right now. We cannot wait on any of these. And in terms of planning, this is really important. So this is a busy slide, so you don't need to read everything. But the point we're trying to make is, if you're looking at a target for 2030, like the indices that Carlo just presented, and you're talking about reducing emissions by 20 or 30%, if you look at these 4 pillars, you can very well do it by using just one of them. Probably with a lot of investment in energy efficiency, you can get to your minus 30 or 20% by 2030. So if we had only this target for 2030, it would be completely okay to just pick one that is the least expensive and to go full speed on one of them. But because the 2030 target is not the final goal, it's just a milestone into the complete decarbonization of the economy, we really need to make progress along these 4 pillars. And it means that it's really important that we have sectoral indicators and sectoral targets when we're looking at 2030, just to make sure we're not only decarbonizing and reducing emissions, but we're doing it in a way that builds the foundation we need to get to zero emissions. So, sectoral indicators and targets are not very popular with economists. If we had a perfect world of rational expectations and perfect foresight and so on, we would not need them. But if you think that people are only looking at your target at 2030, giving them a target in terms of emissions is not enough. They might do it in a way that doesn't build what you need for the full decarbonization. Another thing that we discuss a lot in terms of planning is the role of co-benefits as a way of at least starting the work on decarbonization. So this is nothing new, and a lot of people have been talking about that, but we go at length on how using co-benefits to build a consensus around some of the policies is really important. So starting with congestion, for anybody who has been in big Asian cities in the last decade, you see all the benefits that you can get with efficient public transit in addition to emission reductions. And of course, air quality and health, which is also something that might be able to just pay the cost of emission reductions until at least 2030. So now how do we get there? So the very important point of this first discussion is that we're not only interested in a given reduction in emission, we want to do that in a way that brings us to zero emission. So we really need to build this foundation. So how do we get there? First, we discuss carbon pricing. But we approach carbon pricing maybe slightly differently from what other people have said yesterday. What we say is if you want to convince people to implement carbon or energy pricing and taxes, it might be easier not to start with the social cost of carbon, but easier to start from revenue raising. And with Ministry of Finance, it works just way better. So the way we approach the problem is to say energy or carbon price taxes are just good taxes. They are good taxes because they are targeting something that we don't want to grow. So taxing jobs and investments is a problem because we want jobs and investments to grow. It's not the case of energy consumption and emissions. It's fairly efficient. And what's really important for us, it's relatively easy to put in place even in countries with weak institutions. So tax evasion for energy and carbon taxes are really difficult. This is data from the UK, arguably a country with strong institutions. And you see estimates for tax evasion for corporate tax, VAT, income taxes, and something that is similar to an energy or carbon tax. And clearly tax evasion is much, much lower for the diesel tax because it's much more difficult to move barrels of diesel than just putting money in the carry balance. So fraud for an energy tax in most cases is much more difficult than for the rest. It's especially the case in countries importing their fossil fuels because in most cases you have just a few ports where all of the fuel is arriving. So by controlling a few points, you can basically control completely the import and the energy. So when we're dealing with countries in Africa with taxes that are about 10% of GDP, which is not enough to build infrastructure, education, and health, this is a really, really strong argument. It's even a stronger argument in countries with a lot of informal economy. In most countries with a lot of informal economy, a big part of the economy is not taxed, not for labor, not for investment, nothing, just because it's completely out of the formal world. If you tax energy, especially in countries, again, that import it, you affect the formal and the informal sector the same way, and you remove this disincentive to join the formal sector. So if you increase taxes on the formal sector, people will stay in the informal sector, and you don't want that. So by having a tax that affects everybody the same way, you're really improving the ability of the economy to move toward formality, which we know is key for development and poverty reduction. So this is really our entry point, like carbon taxes as a way of raising revenues and financing public goods and development. So as you know, there are some movements on carbon pricing. More and more countries and jurisdictions are implementing some. The point we're having on this is, at that point, too much discussion about a unique global carbon price might just be counterproductive. Different countries are implemented different taxes or cap and trade or instruments at a level that is politically and socially doable in their country, and we want that to happen. We find that positive. So we don't want countries to be discouraged just because we say that $5 per ton is not sufficient. If a country wants to go for $5, just let's go for it. We'll have time in the future to adjust that. Taxes have a tendency to increase, as we all know. So we really want to be very pragmatic and to start from the benefits of carbon pricing and from what every country are able to do. The point we also want to make is that prices will never be enough for this. So this is a set of reasons why these taxes or prices won't be enough. So to get where we want in terms of emission, we have a problem with incentives. And this is what you try to correct with your pricing strategies. But even if you get your price right, you get many other problems. You get a problem with information access. So people might not know about the technologies that are available, especially in developing countries. You have problem with behaviors. A lot of people are not doing cost-benefit analysis when they buy a car. And you have a problem with resources. A lot of people and countries are just, what matters for them is the ability to invest. It's upfront cash. So if you're looking at energy investments in developing countries, what matters for the country is much more how much they have to invest, because the constraint for them is the ability to borrow and invest. And operational costs and the energy cost that they will have later on is much less important. So they are not minimizing the economic cost over the lifetime of their project. They're trying to minimize upfront costs. And by doing that, they are picking technologies which are less efficient, and they lose productivity and efficiency. So, I mean, having a carbon price doesn't change your choice of technology if the only thing you're looking at is your upfront costs. So in these cases, clearly we need different instruments. So in the report, and I will be quick, but we discussed these different types of instruments. So to develop the technologies we need and to make sure the technologies are implemented in developing countries, we make the point that the costs you're ready to pay per ton of abated carbon might be different if you're talking about the technologies with a lot of potential versus a technology with very little potential. So we paid in Europe a lot for solar because of this idea that solar had a lot of potential and that we really wanted to push this technology, for instance. We also need to act on new investments. So you're looking at Atlanta, you're increasing the cost of gasoline, people won't shift to public transit because there is no public transit, because the city is not designed for public transit. In developing countries at the moment, cities are being built, and this is the time to provide the public transit that can organize a city around public transportation and not cars. So this is something that is completely disconnected for carbon pricing. Carbon pricing will not get you efficient cities in Africa. You need something else. And finally, we discuss behaviors. This is somebody walking a dog in the US, as you have guessed. A lot of the changes we want to implement are changes that should be based on norms and behaviors. And in the same way that everybody in this room thinks that wasting food is bad because we were told that when we were little kids, wasting energy is still completely okay in many places. So we also need this change to happen. Now the third step to conclude, and this is really about how we get that done. We are repeating again and again what needs to happen, but things are not moving fast enough. Maybe it's not only because policymakers and decision makers are stupid. Maybe it's also because we are not providing the answers to the questions these people ask us. So our starting point is that the main question is the political economy and the fact that there is a lot of pushback against climate policies in many cases. And that's why a little bit the question I asked yesterday, when we simulate the negotiations with one person, we have to take into account that the head of state that will negotiate in Paris will then have to go back to the country and talk to the parliament, face elections, and even if the guy is ready to go further, the guy in most cases doesn't want to lose his job, or her job. So we really have to take into account the fact that first, head of states or prime ministers negotiate between each other, and then they negotiate in their country with their population and parliament. And if we look at what are the main obstacles to the implementation, for instance, of carbon pricing, well, if you just about that, you don't want gasoline price to increase. If you just invested in a plant like that, same thing. If you just bought this house, which can be reached only with a car, you don't want gasoline prices to increase. And what's common with all of this is the value of your assets. So you have invested in something that consumes a lot of energy. If energy prices increase, the value of your asset drops, and you will be ready to lobby pretty hard your government not to have a carbon price or an increase in gasoline prices. So we really started from the idea that the value of assets is really a critical thing. We know that it's always very difficult when you affect the value of asset of people. And that's especially the case for housing, because 50% of the wealth of households is in the house. So the value of the house is really something critical. The other point is the point about poverty. Poverty eradication by 2030 is an official goal of the international community, and we clearly don't want climate policies to slow down poverty eradication. So, as I said before, the money you raise with some of these environmental instruments are really interesting because then you can use that to accelerate poverty reduction. You can use that to provide energy access to people who are lacking energy access. So some people will say if you provide energy access, you increase energy consumption and emissions. Yes, but by so little that it really doesn't count. So providing modern energy access to very poor people today is really a good deal. And in some cases, very poor people are using charcoal or very low quality coal. So you get also benefits in terms of emissions, especially with black carbon. Water is the same thing. Using these revenues for water is one of the options that we discuss. Urban planning and public transit are also lacking resources. So we don't really like to have a tax with like earmarking, but in a case like this, if you want to sell it, as was said yesterday, somebody said it, I can't remember who, but maybe you can sell your carbon tax only if you explain what you will do with the revenues and to show that overall people will be winning out of it. One very important point is cooking. If you increase the price of modern energy, you risk locking people into using traditional biomass for cooking, which kills children because of indoor pollution and force women to spend like 2 or 3 hours bringing wood to so the gender implications are also really important. And it's the same thing then for energy access. The additional emission, if you let the very poor people cooking with traditional biomass move to modern cooking, are so small that we have to accept such an increase in emissions because of the benefits that you get. So we have to be very pragmatic, and even though we would like everybody to face the same price, maybe we don't want people to be locked into traditional biomass cooking, and if for that we have to make them face a lower carbon price, I think that's a good deal. In to show what the potential of using the resources from carbon pricing, we use very recent, very good examples of fossil fuel subsidy reforms. Because everybody's talking about carbon pricing and taxes and cap and trade, but for me, the big progress in the last 5 years is about fossil fuel subsidies. More and more countries are reforming their fossil fuel subsidies, so it's increasing the cost of energy, and it can be considered as a sort of carbon pricing. And more countries are doing that, in most cases, not because of the environment, but because they have no choice. So Ukraine, facing the crisis, did it. Egypt, facing financing problem, did it. Iran did it during with the sanctions and the financing problems. So you see countries reforming their fossil fuel subsidies because of economic reasons and fiscal consolidation. And now you have these guys telling you, we did it because we had no choice, but we realized it was a very good deal. And all the countries that were successful in doing so did not just remove the subsidy, because otherwise it's like Nigeria or Bolivia, you get people in the streets and it doesn't go through. What they did is to frame it completely differently. To frame it saying, these fossil fuel subsidies were put in place to help poor people access energy. Good news, we found a much better way to help poor people. We will replace these fossil fuel subsidies by cash transfers. And by doing that, we're much more efficient to help poor people because we know that rich people are the one who consumes energy, so they benefit from the subsidy the most. So this is an experiment. You take 20 countries with fossil fuel subsidies, and you remove $100 of this subsidy, and you give the same amount per capita in your country, so universal cash transfer, basic income. If you do that, 60% of the population, the poorest, benefit, and the bottom quintile gets a net benefit of $13, and the richest are losing $23. So if you replace fossil fuel subsidies by a cash transfer, you're helping poor people, and you're much more efficient in doing that. And something which, for me, is super important and should be super important for all economists, I think. If you want to help poor people and you trust that poor people are smart and decent people who know what's good for them, you really prefer to give them cash and say, do what you think is best for yourself with this cash, instead of saying, we will help you, but to buy energy, because we think that what you need is energy. This is super paternalistic and just disregard completely the fact that these people know what they need. And if they don't need energy, but they need to buy livestock, so be it. So by showing that, I underestimate the benefit of transforming fossil fuel subsidies in cash transfers because I don't take into account the additional freedom that these people will have to spend the money in the way they like. So I think this is really what we should be pushing for a lot for distributional reasons, poverty reasons, and also almost decency reasons. So, I mean, when we say that, I mean, we have many examples now. As I said, Egypt, Jordan, Ghana. Ghana made primary school free when they removed the fossil fuel subsidy, which was also something that the population appreciated a lot. But if you look at the two richest quintile here, we can say that they are rich because they are rich compared with the rest of the population in the country. But if you're looking at Malawi, 80% of the population is in extreme poverty with less than $1.5 per day. So in very poor countries, even if you tax energy and you recycle that into a cash transfer, you will affect people who are super poor compared with the standards you find in Europe and the US. So this is a study by Martin Ravalian, which is, I think, a very interesting one to look at the capacity of countries to redistribute away poverty. So what it shows is the tax level you need on the rich people in the country that you need to raise the resources to eradicate extreme poverty in the country. So if you're a very rich country, that's the right-hand side. If you tax like 1% of the income of the rich and you give it to the poor, basically you cancel extreme poverty. So these are these countries. Basically more than $4,000 in GDP per capita, PPP. These countries can just cancel extreme poverty tomorrow by a very little tax on the rich. The countries below $4,000, well, the entire population is poor, so there is just no much rich people to just tax, to redistribute. So in these countries, what I told you about using the revenues of the carbon tax and so on will not work. So for these low-income countries, and I use this limit at 4,000, even though it depends a little bit on countries and so on, but it's a good benchmark. For the countries with income lower than $4,000, if you want to attack the climate problem without slowing down poverty eradication, you need international support. You need money raised at the international level to help these countries. And if we have international resources, this is where this money should go in priority. To conclude, I have just 1 minute. You want your climate policies to protect poor people and so on. This is an affair of ethics and decency and policy goals. Sometimes you also want to buy opposition and lobbying. These people might not deserve it, but you just might have to do it to get your law. So there are two different problems. One is protecting poor people, and the other one is to buy opposition. In the report, we discuss how to do that and how to make sure the costs of climate policies are not concentrated on some regions or some sectors too much, because then we know that we will get a very strong pushback. And there are many ways of doing that, and we use the example of trade liberalization, because this is a problem that trade liberalization faced too, how to deal with the negative impacts. And if you look at what the US did or what Japan did, you find a lot of examples of policies to support the transition from losing sectors to winning sectors that can be used for climate policies. So I'll conclude here. More in the full report. We have also 3 small policy notes if you don't want to read long documents. And again, more next Thursday with this report on climate change and poverty. Thank you very much.